Today's reading is from Matthew 13, verses 24 through 30 and 36 through 43. He put another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven, he said, is like this. Once upon a time, a man sowed good seed in his field. While the workers were asleep, his enemy came and sowed weeds in among the wheat and went away. When the crop came up and produced wheat, then the weeds appeared as well. So the farmer's servants came to him. Master, they said, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where have the weeds come from? This is the work of an enemy, he replied. So the servant said to him, do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he replied. If you do that, you'll probably pull up the wheat as well while you're collecting the weeds. Let them both grow together until the harvest. Then when it's time for the harvest, I will give the reapers this instruction. First gather the weeds and tie them up in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Then Jesus left the crowds and went into the house. His disciples came and joined him. Explain to us, they said, the parable of the weeds in the field. The one who sows the good seed, said Jesus, is the Son of Man. The field is the world, the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the close of the age, and the reapers are angels. So, when the weeds are gathered and burned in the fire, that's what it will be like at the close of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will collect together out of the kingdom everything that causes offense, and everyone who acts wickedly. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. If you have ears, then hear.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the Wheat in the Weeds. We talk about getting lost in the weeds sometimes, when we get too fixated on something that we can't see the big picture. And I think we have to be careful of that in this particular parable, too. Last week, we considered the parable of the sower, which is recorded just before this, in which there are seed is sown on four different kinds of ground, and we talked about that as representing four different responses to Jesus. And we talked about this idea of confirmation bias, and that how in these four different responses we see how some people just became hardened in their current position, or the current understanding of things. That's like the seed sown on the beside the path. It's hard ground. It's hard. It's impervious. It's hard for anything new to happen there. And then we talked about that was sown on rocky soil. So it takes root. The idea takes root there, but it doesn't flourish in that case. Now, I spoke of that as a situation where sometimes you might hear something different. It makes sense to you, but and you actually may change your belief about that thing, but it's too risky, it's too costly to actually publicly come out with that. And then the other two talk about heading toward being more fruitful. The whole point of that was that story is becoming fruitful. And then this one kind of follows along with that. Parables are stories, and stories can bypass our confirmation bias. If you're already aware that somebody's going to try to convince you or try to get you to change your mind about something, immediately your defenses go up. Because if you believe something, presumably you have a reason for believing that thing. You don't just believe it for no reason, although some people do. Often we take things for granted because of what we were taught as children or the church environment you've been in. You don't really think too much about what you've been taught to believe. You just accept it. But stories can get around that. They can get around our biases. They can get around our defenses. And I think that's part of the reason Jesus teaches in parables. And even though he knows that the parable will actually harden some people in their current position. And that's a hard thing to understand, but I think that's the case. So what we learned last week was we have to be intentional about having ears to hear and eyes to see. Jesus uses that phrase often. What is he saying? He's saying you have to be aware of your confirmation bias. You have to be aware of the fact that you tend to favor things that you already believe opinions that you already hold, and you look for evidence to support those beliefs and opinions. So I think when Jesus says, let them who have eyes to see or ears to hear, hear, he's saying be aware of that problem. Be aware that you tend to get stuck in what you currently believe, and that makes it hard for you to accept anything else. But if becoming more like Jesus is a process of transformation, especially of renewing our mind, then it means we have to be changing. Otherwise, we're stuck. That nothing is changing. Nothing is being transformed. We're not having our minds renewed, even though that can be scary. Jesus knew that some people would hear and understand his parables, and that others would hear and not understand his parables. And he said this, this is from last week, the reason I speak to them in parables is that seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. So we have to keep this in mind, that the parables can be misunderstood. It's possible, and it's likely, I think, that Jesus' teaching in parables can be misunderstood. He intentionally taught with parables, knowing that he would be misunderstood. Now, I have a bachelor's degree in education, and if I had presented this idea to my teachers, my professors, that I'm going to teach music in such a way that only a small percentage of my students get what I'm talking about, I wouldn't have graduated, and I wouldn't have a bachelor's degree. Yet again, Jesus doesn't follow the norms that we follow. He just didn't teach this way. It's as if he understood confirmation bias 2,000 years before the term was coined. He knew that some people's biases and beliefs would make what he was saying incomprehensible to them. And I think the parable of the wheat and the weeds is a parable that includes, that falls into this category. It is a parable, and then it also includes an explanation of the parable. I'm going to propose today that even today, we tend to misunderstand both the parable and the explanation. And I don't want to make you think that what I'm going to suggest today is the only way to understand a parable, because I think parables by nature are meant to be understood in multiple ways. But I am going to call into question some of the ways, the common ways, that we've understood this parable. Okay? You wouldn't expect anything less from me, would you? I know. So let's start at verse 24. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field, but while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. Just keep that in mind. The enemy that sowed the weeds and then left. He got out of there. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. Also, think about wheat. How wheat is planted is not, we don't plant wheat in rows. They didn't then either. You don't have furrows and rows. You just plant the whole field. It's broadcast planting. They just broadcast seed out across the soil, and wheat grows up there. So this is not an orderly row upon row kind of gardening. This is just blast the seed out into the field. And apparently the weeds were sowed in the same way. We'll go on. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. So let's establish first that this is not really a parable about gardening technique, because this is horrible gardening technique. It wouldn't make any sense if you planted a garden and you saw weeds coming up in your garden to just leave the weeds there, leave them alone. Why? Because they would choke out, they would use nutrients from the soil that you want to go toward your crop. If you allowed them to come all the way to maturity, then they would go to seed, and they would, not just those individual weeds that are there would be a problem. Next year, you'd have far more weeds to worry about, because the weed seed would go to the soil as well. the desired crop would be greatly diminished. So we can say this is not Jesus teaching about how to be a really good gardener with a really good green thumb. This is a metaphor, even though this is the kind of gardening I do. I plant them and throw the seed out and hope for the best and get a few things at the end of the year. But no, this is a metaphor. It's not about literal weeds and literal wheat. It's about people in the world, people who will become fruitful and people who will not become fruitful. So it follows on the same kind of thinking the previous parable was, the parable of the sower. It's all about who will be fruitful people in the world and who won't be. And unlike a literal vegetable garden in which the gardener exercises judgment, this is what a gardener does, right? When he sees weeds coming, he judges that weed. He says, "You're out of here," and he yanks it out, and that weed dies. He executes judgment and sentence upon the weeds. But this is a metaphorical garden of people, and Jesus instructs his servants not to pass judgment, but to allow the weeds and the wheat to grow together. So what is Jesus saying there? He's saying trying to rid the world of evil will actually do harm to the wheat. Trying to rid the world of evil will actually do harm to the good people. But isn't ridding the world of evil what Christians are supposed to be doing? Most churches I've been involved in would say yes, that we're here to influence the world in such a way that evil is diminished. And I can see where that can be true, but the methods that are often used become very coercive and judgmental. I think that's what many Christians believe. They believe that we should use whatever means possible to reduce evil in the world, or to be the gardener who passes judgment on the weeds and gets the weeds out of the garden. But this parable makes exactly the opposite point. And this is what would have caught people's attention. When Jesus, these people knew how to garden. So he's talking to people in an agrarian society. They knew about gardening. So the story that they'd been told, which was associated with gardening, is the oldest story in humanity. You got to get the bad people out. You got to get the troublemakers out. You've got to consolidate the good people and shun the evil people. We hear this language today, don't we? We heard it from our current president right after he was inaugurated. He said, "We've got to get the terrorists out. We've got to drive them out. We've got to drive them out." Well, that's one approach. That's the gardener approach. But in this text, Jesus seems to be telling us something different. And this is why your confirmation bias has to be dealt with, because it makes sense to us to rip the weeds out. It makes sense to us to drive out the evil people, right? But the point of this parable seems to be just the opposite of that. That trying to rid the world of evil will actually uproot and destroy the good that is in the world. It's the process of uprooting and driving out that doesn't just affect the, quote, evil people, it affects the good people too. So the Greek word that gets translated here as weeds or tares is this word, zizania. In English, it's darnel. And I've got a picture of darnel there. So when Jesus talks about weeds being sown, he's not talking about some weed that looks radically different than wheat. He's saying darnel. He's saying, and darnel looks almost exactly the same as wheat. You see that? It's very difficult to tell the difference. It actually has the same kind of stalk as wheat, grows about the same height, has a head that looks very similar. So Jesus is not talking about weeds that have nothing in common with wheat. He intentionally chose a plant that would have been very difficult to tell apart from wheat. The weeds that Jesus says were planted by the evil one are not some easily identifiable plant that we could easily go in and eradicate. It reminds me of this quote we've considered before by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He said, "If only it were all so simple. if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Solzhenitsyn understood this parable, I think. He understood that we can't continue to look at the world as good here and evil out there. That we have to recognize all of us have good and evil dwelling in us. That means all other people are the same way. I'm going to also draw from Robert Farrar Capon's work on this parable today. He says, what does this say about the present relationship between the kingdom and the evil in the world? Since good and evil in this world commonly inhabit not only the same field, but even the same individual human beings, since, that is, there are no unqualified good guys any more than there are unqualified bad guys, the only result of a truly dedicated campaign to get rid of evil will be the abolition of literally everybody. So the first thing to keep in mind as we enter this parable is to be aware of our own confirmation bias, our own tendency to see us as the good guys and them as the bad guys. Capon goes on and he says, as the parable develops its point, though, the enemy turns out not to need anything more than negative power. He has to act only minimally on his own to wreak havoc in the world. Mostly he depends on the forces of goodness, insofar as he can succor them into taking up arms against the confusion he has introduced to do his work. That is precisely why the enemy goes away after sowing the weeds. He has no need whatsoever to hang around. This is really insightful. For Jesus is saying the enemy just throws the confusion out there. He just throws the seed out which confuses people, and then he relies on our sense of goodness to do the work of dividing, of passing judgment, of executing, of splitting and going to war with one another. We don't need to go looking under every rock for demons. We are more than capable of enforcing our own demonic goodness on those we think are evil. The work of the devil, according to Capon, is confusion. If he can throw a little confusion in the mix, that heightens our desire for good to be victorious. And at that point, we have to be really careful. Because at that point, we start to do what Jesus explicitly told his disciples not to do. Don't go in and try to weed the garden. Don't go in at that point and try to inflict your judgment on what's going on, because actually if you do that, you're going to cause harm to the good as well. Out of confusion, people act in ways that harm themselves and harm others. So Capon goes on and he writes, unable to take positive action anyway, speaking of the evil one again, unable to take positive action anyway, having no real power to muck up the operation, he simply sprinkles around a generous helping of darkness and waits for the children of light to get flustered enough to do the job for him. Goodness itself, in other words, if it is sufficiently committed to plausible, right-handed, strong-arm methods, will in the very name of goodness do all and more than all that evil ever had in mind. Then he says, if you are worrying that this exposition might form the basis of a case for pacifism, you should continue to worry. But you should also make a distinction. The parable, it seems to me, does not say that resistance to evil is morally wrong, only that it is salvifically ineffective. Salvifically means toward salvation. You may therefore make out as many cases as you like for just wars, capital punishment, or any other sensible right-handed solution to the presence of malefactors on earth. But you must not assume that such solutions will necessarily make the world a better place. You may, in short, take the sword, but you should also remember that those who do so inevitably perish by the sword. Descriptively, not prescriptively. God does not punish people for being non-pacifists. War alone is punishment enough. Yeah, I love capon. Yeah. So far, the parable seems to be pointing us to finding ways to live together with all kinds of people, not trying to impose our judgment upon those we see as the weeds, and being aware that we have our own weed propensity ourselves, within ourselves. Not trying to kill our way to salvation and a better world. But then toward the end of the parable, Jesus says this, and this is what makes this parable difficult. Let both of them grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. So at the last minute, Jesus seems to be saying that even though we should learn to live together without passing fatal judgments upon each other, at harvest time he will do the opposite. He'll be the one passing the fatal judgments. He will have his reapers gather the weeds to be burned and gather the wheat into his barn. It gets even worse when the disciples ask Jesus to explain the parable. So this is like the end of the parable itself. Then a few verses later, they ask him to explain the parable. And we read this. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, saying, explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. So a typical evangelical reading of this explanation would understand this as a description of heaven or hell as eternal conscious torment. Right? That's how we've been conditioned to read this. I believe, though, that this is a misunderstanding of both the parable and the explanation. And I'm not going to really take a stance on whether I think Jesus actually gave the explanation or not. I'm just going to let you guys know that people have disagreements. Scholars disagree about whether this was an addition by Matthew, because there were quite a number of additions. It seemed to be additions or moralizing statements that Matthew makes on the same parables or same stories that Mark and Luke record that don't have those additional statements. So that may have been the case. Maybe Matthew was having a little hard time coming to terms with all of this, and he would put on these moralizing statements. I don't know. I don't think I have to take a hard stance on that. But what I will do is make 4 observations or 4 considerations about this section, this explanation, which most of us have been conditioned to think is Jesus switching gears right in the middle of this parable, which really is talking about how do we live with one another here on earth? How do we live together here without condemning and killing one another? Then he seems to switch gears, if we're from an evangelical bent, and say, I'll do the killing later. You guys just don't live that way now, right? So here's 4 ways, and I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say too when we get there. So what harvest time is Jesus talking about here? He says this is about the end of the age. So we've talked about the ages in Hebrew thought here before, that there was the age which is often called the present age, or the age prior to the Messiah, and then there's the age of the Messiah after the Messiah was to come. So I think one of the most convincing ways that we can understand this as not being about heaven and hell is when Jesus says, when he refers to this time as the end of the age. The end of the age, not the end of the world. So the end of the age, and we've talked about eschatology, was considered the end of the old covenant period, which came fully to a close at AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed, fulfilling all those Matthew 24 prophecies that Jesus gave, saying this is not going to go well with you guys. In AD 70, there was a gathering together, both of those who were followers of Jesus when they left the city, when they left Jerusalem, remembering his prophecy saying, when you see the armies coming around Jerusalem, get out of there, get lost. And they did. Josephus records that no Christians, no followers of Jesus remained in the city. They gathered together outside the city. They left. But then those who opposed Jesus gathered inside the city. And it was a walled city, and that was a logical thing to do. You would assume the safest place to be would be inside the walled city. So there were two gatherings together, similar to what Jesus is talking about, the wheat and the weeds. And there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. And there was fire in AD 70. They burned the city to the ground. So one way to really understand this parable is to say, perhaps Jesus wasn't talking about the end of the world and about post-mortem heaven or hell at all. Perhaps he was warning them about what would happen if they didn't follow him. And if they did continue in their ways of dividing and separating people and passing judgment on people, all the things that gardeners do, that Jesus is encouraging us not to do as people. If this is about the eschaton, the end of time, fire is often, so let me back up. Even if this is a parable about the end of time, we've also considered how the church, especially the patristic fathers and the Eastern Orthodox, understands fire. That fire is not always a destructive force. It is quite often in the Bible portrayed as a purifying fire, as a redemptive fire. So that's my first consideration. The second one is about the binding of the weeds. The weeds are collected and burned up with fire. Verse 30 says, "Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned." So what is it that binds people together? I mean, we should know this with Gerard's thought. Yeah, scapegoating. People bind themselves together when there's a threat going on or when something needs to be resolved. They tend to bind themselves together against a scapegoat, right? So the all against all shifts into all against one scapegoating mechanism. That is a very powerful binding mechanism that we just practice often without even thinking about it. Interestingly, the root word for religion in Latin is religare. I'm not a good Latin pronouncer. religare, and it means to bind together. Religion in Latin means to bind together. And yes, there is a positive way in which religion can bind us together, but there is also a very negative way that religion can bind us together, huh? The idea that we need to bind together to root out the evil and bind them together and cast them out. It's a very common religious practice, but it's a very un-Christ-like religious practice. Okay, and the third consideration I had was the judgment of the world. So we tend to think of this from an evangelical sense as the time when the world is judged, but we put it off into the future after the second coming. But you remember in John's gospel, Jesus spoke of the judgment of the world, not in a post-mortem sense, but as the cross being the judgment of the world. Jesus says, now is the judgment of the world. This was the night before he was crucified. Now is the judgment of the world. He saw the cross as judging the world. Why? Because when God came into our midst, we judged him as evil and crucified him. We judged ourselves, in other words. And his going to his death, not resisting our judgment, revealed that to us, made that possible for us to see. Paul Nectarline writes, "We might come to see the explanation of this parable as portraying the judgment of the Son of Man as the following. When his angels will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin, or scandals in Gerardian terms, and all evildoers, or doers of lawlessness, it happens precisely through exposing it, first on the cross, and then through subsequent witnesses or martyrs. the angels or messengers. The angelos in Greek means messenger. Angel is just a messenger. The causes of sin and evil may be identified as our human attempts to weed out evil, so that this evil is judged by the Son of Man suffering it on the cross in order to expose it. He goes on, a key verse in Matthew's gospel is Matthew 11:12. This verse used to drive me crazy. And I don't know if it's bugged you or not, but the verse reads, "From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force." You remember that verse? So in charismatic circles, people shout that and they dance around that verse and everything, thinking it means we've got to get violent to implement the kingdom of God, right? Let me read you what Paul Nectarline says. Even when Jesus speaks in the conventional language of judgment, the kingdom of heaven might be represented through those who are suffering the violence. That's actually what Jesus did. Isn't Jesus the embodiment of the kingdom of heaven? And didn't he suffer our violence on the cross? And the violence tried to take the kingdom of heaven by force? I think there's a much healthier way to understand this verse. Let me back up. Even when Jesus speaks in the conventional language of judgment, the kingdom of heaven might be represented through those who are suffering the violence. We see the inauguration of the kingdom of heaven especially in the cross of Jesus, followed by all disciples who are willing to be martyred, willing to suffer violence before they will inflict it. In our time, the exemplary disciples have been people such as Gandhi, who did very much base his nonviolent resistance on the Sermon on the Mount, and Martin Luther King Jr., who continue this form of judgment. When you don't respond in kind, when you don't respond violently to violence, you reveal the violence for what it is. They play their hand. They reveal what they're all about. And then number 4, the Greek word aphete. Now, I'm going back to Capon here. He says the most remarkable word in this whole parable you have to see in the Greek, aphete. It's the word that's translated as permit or suffer both to grow together. Permit both to go or suffer both the wheat and the weeds to grow together, okay? The other major meaning of this word in the New Testament is forgive. The malice, the evil, the badness that is manifest in the real world and in the lives of real people is not to be dealt with by attacking or abolishing the things or persons in whom it dwells. Rather, it is to be dealt with only by an aphesis, by a letting be, that is a forgiveness, that is a suffering. So this word where Jesus says let or allow or to suffer can also be translated forgive. In other words, deal with the evil that's in the world, not by passing judgment on it, not by executing it, not by casting it out, not by scapegoating it, but by forgiving it. James Allison says there is only one way not to be locked into the scandals of this world, and that is by learning to forgive, which means not allowing oneself to be defined by the evil done against them. Not allowing you to define yourself by the evil done to you. That's the victimage idea that we get. You know, sometimes we'll play the victim. We define ourselves according to what evil has been done against us. Allison's saying, no, don't do that. Forgive that. Otherwise, you'll define yourself by the evil that was done against you. And I have one more quote from Paul Nectarline. And I'll see what you guys have to say. Matters of sin and evil are not as distinct for us as we might think. Matters of sin and evil are not as distinct for us as we might think. We are always, since the foundation of our human worlds, thinking that we know the keys to recognizing good and evil, which was the temptation in Genesis 3. But it's not as simple a matter as we think. It's like trying to pick weeds out from a field blanketed in wheat. Those under the influence of the victimage mechanism, acting on the satanic accusation, which is all of us, always think we can pick out the culprits and eliminate them. It took Jesus being put forward as one sacrifice to our efforts at weeding the Lamb of God to begin to take away this sin of the world. So he's trying to say the sin of the world in this case is our judging one another, our trying to play God with one another. It's the exact first temptation that we fell for, and we still do it. Okay.